sense, economists are rather hard-headed people. They don't especially like to spend a lot of time worrying about all the various methods they might use to answer questions, but they just want to get on with answering the questions, or at least they like to pretend that they're hard-headed. But I find that occasionally it's useful to step back and reflect on the methods that we use to answer big economic questions. And that's what we're going to try to do this morning. And fortunately, we have three very reflective economists with us, who I will introduce briefly. Wendy Carlin is a professor at University College London, a distinguished macroeconomist, and in the last decade she's been a leader in an innovative project for creating a new online introductory course in economics that makes economics immediately relevant. And it's offered for free to students and teachers alike. I'm also pleased to say that as of 2 days ago, Wendy is Vice President of the International Economic Association. Raj Chetty is my colleague in the economics department at Harvard. He's very well known for his masterful use of huge data sets to answer critical questions about equality of opportunity in the United States and such questions as the effect that school teachers have on students' lives. Recently, he shook up the world of Ivy League colleges by showing the extraordinary extent to which the admissions process in these colleges favors the rich. And Andreu, Mas-Colell, at the end, used to be my colleague at Harvard until nostalgia for Barcelona and a chance to lend a big hand in the new university, Pompeu Fabra, lured him back to Catalonia. He's been a professor at Pompeu Fabra for many years now, and some of his extracurricular activities include participating as a cabinet minister in the Catalan government and founding the Barcelona School of Economics. He also happens to be one of the leading economic theorists of our time. So that's our panel, and we will proceed as follows. Each panelist will speak for 12 minutes. I will try to keep them to that. And then I'll open things up for them to talk amongst themselves. They can make follow-up points. They can comment on one another's presentations. They can ask each other questions. And then if there is time at the end, we can take some questions from the audience. But now it's time to start. Wendy, would you please lead us off?
Thanks very much, Eric. So it's an enormous privilege and honor to be here on this panel speaking to you. And what I want to talk about is, or to suggest, is that economists now study civil society. So let's begin here and read this quote. "It's a mistake to limit collective action to state action. Many other departures from the anonymous atomism of the price system are regularly observed. Firms of any complexity are illustrations of collective action. Ethical and moral codes are reactions of society to compensate for market failures." So the question is, who said it and when? Guesses? Stiglitz, you think? So this was Kenneth Arrow in 1971, and I want you to remember the date. So since he wrote in 1971, economist research has broadened enormously beyond the anonymous atomism of the price system and collective action by states to include what we call civil society. It's not entirely clear this is a good name, and there's a competition out there to provide a better one. The we in this is joint work with Sam Bowles and Sahana Subramanian, and it's very new. It's in a way prompted by thinking about coming in and talking here. So the way we think about civil society is that it refers to families, firms as organizations, so that connects with the red quote from Arrow initially, trade unions and other private organizations, neighborhoods and identity groups. And those of you who were at Sergei Gurev's talk yesterday will recognize the importance of the latter. So the claim is that two developments in economics have contributed to this shift. New models of non-market interactions and incomplete contracts in labor, credit and other markets, so you can think of principal agent models, and the recognition of the importance of ethical and other regarding preferences along with self-interests, so a much richer version of what people are like has come into to economics. So the idea is that what I want to suggest is that what we collectively study has moved, or we can think of trying to map it in a sense in this triangle or simplex with these three nodes. So if you think about the state, what we can think of in each case. Just think about motivations and the implementation of allocations. So motivation in the state node is compliance with legitimate state authority, and the implication of allocations comes through fiat and elections, okay, regulation, if you want to think about it like that. So think about the other node there at the bottom of markets. Obviously, the motivation are material incentives, and allocations are implemented by prices and competition with complete contracts. In the top, which with this civil society label on it, are a different set of motivations: reciprocity, altruism, fairness, sustainability, dignity, identity, so in and out group thinking. And those allocations are implemented differently by social norms and the exercise of private power. So you can think of that happening, for example, within a firm. So to try and put some sort of quantitative spin on this, what we do is to look at a sort of long 100 years of economics research published in these 7 journals. So we've got the corpus, or the database, is some 27,500 articles, and after you've fiddled around with it, you end up with about 10,800 words or tokens of meaning. So you get rid of all the stop words, the, and all the uninteresting ones, and you create bigrams of something like minimum wage, things that go together. And then the idea is to use a form of probabilistic machine learning called topic modeling to extract the topics that are most likely to have written this body of research. So you could say, well, why 100? Well, 100's as good as any number. But yes, did we choose the number? Yeah, 100. Something like 100 gel codes gives you an idea of why it might be a decent number. And what I want to just give you a tiny hint, so that I don't run out of my 12 minutes, about what this kind of means. So the question is, which topics wrote the Carlin-Kruger famous article, just to pick one. So this is the 1994 minimum wage and employment article, and hardly surprisingly, the topic that was most responsible for writing this article was the topic called wage determination. There's nothing special about it being called topic 1. The numbering of topics is entirely random between 1 and 99. And then there's applied econometrics, cross-section and panel. Well, that's another obvious topic that was involved in writing the article. And you can see the words that, so just think of every article published over that long century as a bag of words. That's all it is. There's no meaning to the order, no nothing, just the bag of words. And this is the story about the topics that wrote it. So next thing we do is to divide up the topics, not all of the topics, because some of them are really uninteresting, like French language. There were some articles written in French. Okay, that's hardly interesting for this exercise. But we divide up the topics into three buckets. State, you can see all the things you'd expect: monetary policy, fiscal policy, social security, welfare, and so on. In the market bucket, you can see going from sales strategies, competition and market structure, auctions there. And then in the civil society one, we've got topics like monitoring and enforcement, labour unions, game theory and behavioural economics, strategic interactions, and so on, democratic political competition. So that gives you an idea of how we can divide up these topics that wrote all of the research, okay? All of the research published in the those 7 journals over that period of time. And the question is, and what you should form in your mind, and it would have been nice to give you all a piece of paper, and you could have, X marks the spot. You could have tried to place where you think you'd find the trajectory of economics research in this simplex. That's what I would like you to imagine in your head. Okay, where do you think it started? Where did you think it went? What kind of pattern does the research draw out? And this is, I'll get to that in a second. I'm giving you time to think about it. So this is just another way of thinking about the words that are found with greatest frequency. So this is the word cloud for each of those meta-topics, the 3 meta-topics that on each of the nodes of the simplex. Okay, so just to give you a bit more sense of what this is doing. And there you go. So how good was your guess? So what this shows is that research, so this is, that's 1900 to 1924, okay? Closest to the state pole. And then there's more or less a movement directly along here with an increased focus on the market topics. And then 1969, okay, remember the date of that quote from Arrow. Then we head up here towards the civil society pole. So let's think about what might have been going on. And it's interesting that the published research started over there in the state node, but even during a period when the role of the state increased greatly in the economy, its importance in economic research declined with the importance growing of the market topics. So one explanation for this could be it could be the formalization. It could be something internal to the discipline, the increasing use of maths and the formalization of Marshall, for example, happening through that period, even as out there in the world, the role of the state was becoming of greater importance. In 1972, in a very interesting article published, thanks, that's great, published by Aberlerner, called "The Politics and Economics of Consumer Sovereignty." What he said, this article is very interesting because it highlights both the strength and the vulnerability of economics. He said, an economic transaction is a solved political problem. And economics has gained the status as the queen of the social sciences by choosing solved political problems as its domain. So by converting conflicts into economic transactions. So think of, for example, an external effects, implementing a tax on the pollution. Then you've translated a conflict into a solved political problem by making it an economic transaction. So that was 72. So roughly the same time as Arrow made his remarks. And again, there is the idea that maybe it was the formalization within economics, the growing capability to formalize strategic interactions, information problems, incomplete contracts, and so on, that meant that from the 1970s onwards, economists didn't actually double down on solved political problems. So that's really what I'm trying to suggest. We saw that movement going up towards the civil society node. So that, I think, is what might turn out to be interesting about this way of thinking about how the research corpus interacts with the changing methods within the discipline, and how that interacts also with the problems in the world that animate our research as well. So that's where I'll stop.
That was a model, Wendy, not only of clarity, but of sticking to the time limit. And Raj, you're on now.
Okay. Great. So is this working? Can you hear me okay? No. Maybe I can just swap with you for 1 second. Great. Okay. So this seems to be working. So thanks so much, Eric, for organizing this panel. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and to join Wendy and Andreu as well. So as Eric mentioned in his introduction, I've been thinking in my research recently about how we can use large-scale data to improve our thinking about various economic and social policy questions. I think we're living in an era of unprecedented availability of data, which, as we all know in our lives, is transforming the way we do many different things. And so what I thought I'd do in the context of this panel is talk about how I think the availability of that sort of data has implications for the methodology we use in many different parts of economics. And rather than discussing that in abstract terms, thought I'd try to illustrate by talking about the topic that I've been focused on in my recent work, which is thinking about equality of opportunity and how we can give kids of all backgrounds better chances of rising up and how to increase social mobility. And so let me start by showing you this international comparison here of rates of upward mobility across countries. So you can loosely think of this, the way we would think about this idea in America is, what are your odds of achieving the American dream of rising from the bottom of the income distribution to perhaps the top of the income distribution in the next generation? So what this is showing is just a quintile transition probability. What is your probability as a child of having income in the top fifth of the income distribution, conditional on growing up in a family that was in the bottom fifth of the income distribution? And you can see that there's an enormous amount of variation in this probability across countries around the world. If you take a country like Brazil, for example, I was also trying to look up data on Colombia on the way over here. It turns out I don't think you have exactly the same statistics, but my understanding is rates of social mobility don't look that different from a place like Brazil. And in Brazil, you have only a 2.5% chance of reaching the top fifth if you start out in the bottom fifth. Incredibly low rates of social mobility. If you're born into poverty, odds are you're going to remain poor in the next generation. The US, which is supposedly the land of opportunity, looks better than Brazil on that dimension, but nowhere close to the rates of social mobility you see in places like Denmark, Canada, and Sweden, and so on. So naturally, I think it's a question of great interest for economists, for policymakers, for the general public. What drives these differences? How might you increase rates of social mobility in countries like Brazil and the United States and so forth? Many people have thought about questions like that in economics, in the social sciences more broadly, for more than a century. But of course, when we just have data at this level of aggregation, if we're comparing the US to Denmark to Sweden, there are 100 things that are different about these societies, and so it's very hard to pin down exactly what's going on at that level of aggregation. What I think large-scale data allows us to do in the context of this question, in the context of many, many other questions, is essentially disaggregate the data in much finer ways, and I think allows us to get a better understanding of mechanisms, which then has implications for various parts of economics. And so let me illustrate that by showing you how we're able to disaggregate that national picture for the United States, looking across different parts of America in this map here. And so what we're doing here, let me spend a quick second describing what this is, and then tell you, what I think some of the implications are. So what we're doing here is taking data on 20 million kids drawn from tax records in the US, which we have covering the entire population, linking them back to their parents, linking them back to the exact place in which they grew up. And in each of those areas, we're constructing a simple measure of upward mobility. We're saying if you grew up in a low-income family at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, what is your average income in adulthood when you're 35 years old? The map is colored so that red-orange colors represent places where kids are less likely to rise up. Blue-green colors are places where kids are more likely to rise up. And you can see, if you just look at the scale, that even within America, there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up. In some of the center of the country, your odds of upward mobility look better than in Sweden. In other parts of the country, like in the Southeast, it looks more like Brazil. And so, that's really useful, first of all, to just understand that, it's not a monolithic thing. But more importantly, from a methodological point of view, now in some sense you have many more data points. You can start to ask, what's different about Dubuque, Iowa versus Charlotte, North Carolina, which is one of the lowest upward mobility places in America. You can make comparisons across those places. You can look at people who move between these different places, as we've done in a series of studies, to understand the causal mechanisms through which one place is leading to higher upward mobility than others. And moreover, you can go even finer in some of our more recent work. We can now do this at a neighborhood level, literally looking census tract by census tract. So each of these have about 4,000 people in them. Showing you a snapshot here for New York City. You can look up this data for any part of the United States. And you can see, in certain parts of New York, you have great chances of rising up. In other parts of New York, like in Brooklyn and the Bronx and so forth, you have very poor chances of rising up. So these differences, they're not arising just at a global level. They're actually arising on different sides of the street, even within New York City. And so that suggests the kinds of mechanisms we should be thinking about are far more granular than thinking about purely just national policies or state-level policies or labor market conditions, things like that. So why is this kind of data useful? As I've been saying, I think it can give us a sharper understanding of mechanisms that are driving key questions that we care about. So to give you one illustration of a mechanism that I think comes out clearly from looking at these kinds of data in this context, here's an illustration of the kind of analysis one can do, where on the left is this data from the Opportunity Atlas, the map of upward mobility that I just showed you, drawn from the tax records. On the right is another map drawn from a different big data source, so to speak, a completely distinct data source, Facebook data, on the nature of friendships that 70 million people using the Facebook platform have in the US. And in particular, we're looking at one particular measure of social capital, the fraction of high-income friends that low-income people on the Facebook platform have. And there, in that map on the right, green colors are places where there are more cross-class friendships, and the red colors are places where there's more disconnection across class lines. And you can see immediately, if you compare those two maps, that they look incredibly similar to each other. And a series of analyses that I won't get into here, we have a strong sense that there's a causal link between these two things. And in particular, when you grow up in an environment where there's more cross-class interaction, that those kinds of social networks matter a lot in terms of giving kids better chances of rising up. Societies that are more fragmented by class tend to offer less social mobility as well. Okay, so that is one of many different examples of work that we and other researchers have done to try to understand mechanisms in this particular context. So with that background, let me now just say a little bit in the next couple of minutes about what I think this kind of big data analysis means for how we do economics more broadly going forward. So I think this sort of data and the way we can learn from it has implications for many different facets of our discipline, starting, of course, from econometrics, so analysis of data like this, where, substantively the way I think about it is when we have lots of data, it's not just that we can estimate the parameters of models that we were interested in traditionally more precisely. Obviously, you can do that and you can get smaller standard errors in some sense. But I think more importantly and more excitingly, you can estimate a much more high-dimensional set of parameters and understand things with much greater heterogeneity, really understanding how things vary across places, as in the example that I was showing you, or across subgroups over time, based on conditions that are changing over time. Basically, you can have a much more high-dimensional model of how the world works, and at least in the kinds of questions I've thought about, that always proves to be extremely fruitful. A low-dimensional sort of view that there's a single labor supply elasticity or a single behavioral response almost never fits the data very well. And that raises a number of interesting econometric questions where as you have more data, you're also trying to estimate a higher dimensional set of parameters. Indeed, much of the frontier of one way to think about what people are doing in econometrics is how to think about that kind of high dimensional estimation in a rigorous way, where there are many different issues that arise related to multiple hypothesis testing, shrinkage issues, noise in parameters, and so on. More generally, thinking about how to combine large-scale observational data with experimental data, I think, is a very interesting frontier for our field to do more with as we have more and more of this observational data. But it's not just about data. I think, importantly, there's also a discourse to be had between empirical work and economic theory. So if we think about the kind of canonical work that people like Eric and Andreu have done that have really been foundational in our discipline, I think there are ways to draw insight from the patterns we're seeing in these new data to develop new models that may make better predictions. So to give you one example in the context of the topic I've been talking about, canonical models of economic mobility and inequality basically focus on traditional economic incentives in a neoclassical setting where people are optimizing, choosing the best place to live, choosing the best school for their kids, so forth and so on. When we look at these data that I was showing you, it's extremely clear that that's not how it really works. People, especially lower income folks, don't really seem to choose the best neighborhood for their kids. Ex post, if you help them move to a better neighborhood, they seem much happier than where they were before. Things like social networks seem to play a key role in people's decisions, in their ultimate outcomes, and so forth. And so I think, as one example, bringing in the role of social networks in models of neighborhood choice, spatial equilibrium, something that's not traditionally done in many different fields. If you think about the urban economics literature or the international trade literature, embedded in traditional neoclassical models of choice, of course, a very natural starting point. But my view is bringing in some of what we're seeing in these data may help us make better progress in making better predictions and also make better policy recommendations going forward. And so in the last couple of minutes here, let me point to that. In addition to having a better positive understanding of how the world works, I think ultimately, at least part of what interests me in these issues is the idea that we might actually be able to make things better using these types of tools. And so I just want to give you an example of how, again, I think the availability of data can change the way we approach policy questions. So I'll give you a concrete example. In that map that I showed you at the beginning, I pointed out that Charlotte, North Carolina, turns out to be one of the cities with the lowest levels of upward mobility in America. So to show you why that kind of granular data can in and of itself be very motivating from a policy perspective, when we put that data out publicly, you can see the local newspaper called this a wake-up call for Charlotte. How can it be that we are a place that offers such poor opportunities for our kids? People got very animated about that. The local basketball team had a T-shirt saying, they're 50 out of 50 in terms of economic mobility. We should do something about this, and so on. And then they actually did. So over the past 10 years, they've done a number of things, spent $300 million on initiatives to try to increase economic opportunity. Businesses have made commitments to hire kids growing up in low-income families in Charlotte itself. They've changed affordable housing regulations, zoning regulations, and so forth, all of which can, in principle, I think have a significant impact on kids' lives going forward. And so again, it just shows that getting down to this level of granularity, which is feasible with big data, is, I think, extremely valuable from a policy perspective. And I'll end on this. Something I had not thought about is that I really get I think how we teach economics, which is not how I had gotten into this, but is connected to Wendy's pioneering work in this space as well, can be greatly influenced by the availability of these sorts of data. So to give you an example of that, at Harvard, I teach this elective class that has 500 students called Economics 50, using big data to solve economic and social problems. And the idea there is simply by showing students these kinds of data in very simple ways, I think you can really inspire students to think more about our field. So I asked students in the first problem set to just think about the question of, suppose they had grown up in a neighborhood 2 miles down the road in their city using the Opportunity Atlas data, would they be sitting in this audience, in the auditorium at Harvard? To what extent does that determine how well kids do? What does that mean in terms of what we can learn going forward and so on? And so I think there's great potential there as well. Finally, just recognizing that we're in an international context here, I've presented a lot of US-related work, but obviously these issues are not relevant just for the United States, and I'm encouraged to see that around the world, people are starting to think about these kinds of questions, and I think there's a lot that we can do as a field around the world to make progress in these ways. Thanks so much.
I just wanted to apologize to Raj. I wasn't trying to harass him. I just couldn't figure out how to turn off my clock. But Andreu, okay. It's your turn.
You can harass me when the time comes.
My clock will.
My role in this panel has to be to talk about theory. I take as solid and acquired wisdom that economics needs theory, and if so, it needs a specialist in theory, as in public finance and what have you. We are still far from research practices of the natural sciences involving the collaboration of many specialists, as reflected in long authorship lists, sometimes because of ex-ante planning, it's the most desirable, sometimes because of ex-post accumulation. In economics, we are moving in the same direction, and on the whole, this is a good thing. Roughly speaking, theorizing in economics takes the form of model building. I believe it was Solo that described modeling as an art. The artist has to have a good insight to uncover the key traits of what's being modeled, and a good eye to combine them as colors in a canvas to produce a good model. But lifting a page from the physicists Jaffe and Quinn, it is not only art, there must also be discipline, anchors, constraining flight into pure speculation, often fueled by claims or sometimes just tweets based on intuition or educated guesses. Models can be of many kinds. Descriptive models, built to understand a concrete economic reality. The disciplines for these models comes from the empirical test. Ideally, the research program that leads to the model and to the empirical test should be developed from the start with the two aspects in mind. If validated empirically, the model will be particularly good if it is interesting, if it connects with basic principles, if it is parsimonious, if it is simple, if it is elegant, and mainly if it is seminal. Conceptual models designed to clarify the logic of basic concepts. The discipline is logical consistency, often in the form of mathematical rigor and theorem proving. Predictive models, the discipline has to be the empirical quality of the productions. Prescriptive or policy models meant to describe potential realities. If the research remains on paper, the discipline is logical consistency, yet the quality and the impact of the research is much enhanced if it leads to an actual implementation that passes the empirical test of working as theoretically expected. I have been raised with the founding mission statement of the Econometric Society, the advancement of economic theory in its relation to statistics and mathematics, which suggests organizing my intervention around how the new tools available today influence or might influence the style of present and future theorizing. I summarize the new tools in the standard triad: computational power, big data, and artificial intelligence. The availability of huge computational power and of big data has expanded dramatically the disciplining possibilities, hence the possibilities of good theory. First, because it has opened the door to proof by simulation. With it, we may lack the absolute certainty of a classical mathematical proof, but loosely speaking, we can analyze and establish the logical consistency of models to any degree of approximation, including many for which proving theorems may be hard. Second, because the increased possibilities of empirical validation makes more attractive to devote efforts to descriptive modeling. In a sense, the proverbial stylized facts may become more real facts. And I say, and I think this connects with the last remark of Raj. As illustration, let me point out that the data and comparison and computation power now available invites theories to build models that are economy-wide for some aspects. In the physical and experimental sciences, the concept of the digital twin of the brain, of the liver, of the solar system, even of a system, has become common. Economics will not be immune to the trend, as it may be helpful for policy purpose. I discuss this further in the context of a diachronic exercise. Consider the debate on the possibility of socialism that took place in the first half of the last century. A main question was, is socialism possible? There were many answers, positive and negative. The most brilliant in the positive side was Oscar Lange's. Essentially, he argued that socialism requires central planning, and that the central planning problem was one of computation of the shadow prices associated to a grant optimization problem. Lange had to face a serious difficulty. The optimization problem had too many variables and too many constraints for it to be realistic that an administrative center could control only with this tool the daily beat of the economy. To counter, Lange proposed market socialism. The central planner controls a few key prices, lets real markets operate for the rest, and adjusts the key prices until the desired market equilibrium is reached. The fundamental welfare theorems justify the procedure. In the 60s, Lange published The Computer and the Market, a brief booklet embodying the point of view of the market as a computation mechanism for the right prices. Yet, by that time, he wasn't ready in thrall of computers. He writes, I quote, "The market is a cumbersome and slow-working servo mechanism. Its iterated process operates with considerable time lags and oscillations, and it might not be convergent at all. In this respect, the electronic computer shows an unchallenged superiority. It works with enormous speed," that was the 60s, does not produce fluctuations in real economic processes, and the convergence of its iterations is assured by its very construction. I have little doubt that if in the 30s we would have had the computing possibilities and the abundance of data today, the planning camp would have felt in a much stronger positions and perhaps dispense with markets altogether. It will still have lost the intellectual battle. The deepest critique the planning camp encountered was not one of computational or statistical difficulty, but Hayek's, based on the availability of information, that is, of data. For Hayek, much of the key information lies in the private realm of people. It is dispersed, and it is only revealed if there are incentives to reveal. The fact that in our digital age we see the emergence of more market rather than less makes me think that the Hayek critique retains its force. Perhaps the market is best seen not as a computer, but as an information revelation mechanism. That said, there is no doubt that to the extent that modern market economies have to be, if not planned, at least heavily regulated, the abundance of data and computation power has to be a boon for the possibility of effective regulation and policy. For example, borrowing a term from health policy, we could even contemplate a sort of personalized welfare policy. At any rate, it can be anticipated that theories will have much food for thought about issues such as how to balance the advantages of central authorities disposing of much personal information, the sort that Hayek regarded as dispersed, against the risk that the central authority goes rogue. a danger unfortunately present even in democratic countries. On AI, its ability will not displace theory, but will it displace the theorist? I do not think so. The theories will remain in command because two essential components of the theorizing activity are asking questions and conceptualizing models. In this, the role of AI will be limited. The fundamental and deep questions will come from humans. That said, what about the answers to the questions or about the analysis of the models? It cannot be ruled out that AI could go a long way in these dimensions. But this is in principle is a good thing, isn't it? Since then AI becomes then simply a tool that increases the productivity of the human, and who can complain about that? But let's look deeper. Theories are not born into adulthood. Their development is a chain. The answer to the first question prompts the subsequent one, and the analysis of some models suggests new ones. Therefore, beyond asking if AI can produce answers to questions, we should ask if AI can produce interesting answers, answers that provide understanding. The key word is understanding, and lead to interesting next questions. I naively put to ChatGPT the following question, quote, "You have a population of an even number of agents. They have to be matched in pairs. Each agent has strict preferences over matching with other agents. And overall matching is stable if there is no pair that abandoning the current match, and pairing among them will both improve. Question, given preference, is there always a stable matching? If there is a counterexample, can you formulate a sufficient condition for a positive answer?" Unquote. After a bit of prodding on my part, I got a couple of exquisitely well-argued yet wrong counterexamples, and a correct answer, namely, use the Gale-Shapley mechanism. That's it. All I was testing was the quality of ChatGPT as a search engine. As I said, all this was very naive, which of course means that the real test for AI has to be its ability to give interesting answers to questions which are new or even harder an answer. As for new questions, consider the domain of mechanism design. AI could not invent the questions or the research agenda, but I suppose it is conceivable that duly programmed, it could answer some precise questions of the type, give me a mechanism with this or that property. More difficult would be to obtain an exactly optimal mechanism and some well-defined criterion, as we could get into the territory of NP or not NP completeness. As I remark, my impression is the impossibility theorem will keep occupying the time and the efforts of theories, and they will be comparatively harder to mechanize. By unanswered questions, I mean research topics that have been substantially studied, but which are clearly not closed. In contrast with the new questions, we now have many available training instances to which apply machine learning techniques. It cannot be excluded that AI could provide shortcuts, even spectacular ones, to well-understood research programs, much as DeepMind did for the structure of proteins a couple of years ago. But I am skeptical that for those questions where after much application of brain power, we are in the dark, the current AI could improve on humans, as what probably is lacking are new ideas. The type of AI that will be well adapted to answer new and unanswered questions will be the one associated with the program of the initial phase of AI, which relies on formalizing deduction and logical thinking. As the founders, McCarthy, Simon, etc., put in a famous application for funding, I quote, "The study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning of any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. This problem got stuck. The precisely described was a killer, but who knows? the problem of integrating logic and deduction may yet revive. In summary, my sense is that AI will not be adept at the formulation of seminal theoretical questions or in model building, but in combination with computational power and big data, will help to develop more and better theory. Theory that gallops with the imagination of art, but that is reined in with the discipline that provided by the newer additions to our box of tools. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andreu. Thank you, all three of you. I'd like now to give you the opportunity to follow up or ask one another questions or whatever you'd like.
Yeah, this is working. Yeah, okay, so Raj, it seemed to me that the granularity of the data and, you know, this, where you compared the Facebook data with the more traditional data, showing that these really tiny differences living across the street, the kind of connections that you've got, that fits very well into the kind of argument that I was suggesting about the questions that economists can now answer.
Yeah, so thanks, Wendy. Yeah, absolutely. So as you were speaking, you know, I think there are many connections between what all three of us were saying, of course. And so in your simplex, that very nice way of representing economic thought, I can imagine that the availability of data and other tools that Andreu was talking about will move us in that simplex. And I think the question is in which direction we move. And I think that will end up changing in some ways what economic theory looks like, what types of policies are implemented, and so forth. So I certainly think there's an enormous opportunity there. Whether that actually happens, I think that's part of the purpose of having a session like this. I hope people here, especially students here, will be encouraged to go in that direction.
Just a couple of things on Wendy's talk. I thought in the world there is not one state. There are 200 or so states, and that's essential. So all that realm of interactions among states, it fits into state or it fits into civil society, or how does it? And let me ask him something. I mentioned the word personalized welfare policy, and that fits with the granularity. And somehow one traditional objection to differentiate in social policy is the stigma element. But these techniques allows for preservation of privacy. Maybe there is room for, well, anyhow, that's it.
So the sort of, I think, thinking in terms of that simplex helped you perhaps think about the complementary advantages in modelling that come from combination. So it's really all about what's going on inside rather than what's going on at one or other of the poles. And that's, and we can think of it perhaps both in terms of the questions that can be asked, which is what you were raising, and the new questions that we can ask given the kind of new data that we've got, but also using that same space, we can think about the way that policies can be implemented, so that there are both new problems driving new theory, but not only that, as I tried to suggest. I think there's internal to the discipline dynamics going on. But we can also think of combinations of those allocation mechanisms that are probably required. For example, if we're thinking about climate policy, we're not just thinking about combining regulation and market incentives. We're thinking about, for example, endogenous preferences, green preferences, and the way that that those can complement the other forms of intervention.
If I could just follow up on that. Some of the terms that you were using and slotted into one of the three categories or the other could clearly fit in multiple categories. And so how did you decide which one it went into, and how much did that affect the trajectory that you showed us?
Yeah, so that's, and and I also need to directly answer Andreu. But yes, so obviously you need to have a kind of robustness procedure whereby you swap topics in and out from the different nodes and see what difference that makes. So yes, so there's a kind of arbitrary division of topics, in placing them within the meta topics, and then you want a kind a means of creating kind of surfaces around the nodes that will help you understand how much difference it makes that you placed one of the topics in there, or even threw it out, for example. But Andreu's point about the states interacting, yeah, so that's suggesting that where we're talking about interactions, strategic interactions, for example, among states, then we need to use some of the theory from the top, from this so-called civil society. So the central move towards game theory, and placing game theory as you do in your textbook, right at the beginning, is what's reflected, I think, in this move up towards that pole.
Maybe I can just quickly comment on Andreu's point about the personalized welfare economics, which I think is exactly right. That way I think about it abstractly is you basically have a richer set of policy tools than you had in the past. So from a public finance perspective, you can make an analogy to the shift from the Ramsey approach to optimal policy and optimal taxation to the Merleesian approach, where thinking about linear instruments initially and now thinking about a nonlinear, completely flexible set of policy instruments. But we would not traditionally think of in public finance models conditioning the set of policies on individuals or on neighborhoods or on local context in some way, simply because that wasn't really feasible in the policy domain. And now it is, but as you note, that doesn't necessarily mean you want to automatically do that. I think that's going to raise a whole host of new questions about stigma, about incentive effects, the same kinds of questions in a way that were confronted in the context of the Merleesian revolution. So I think that's very exciting to think more about those issues.
We have about 6 minutes left, and so maybe this is a good time to take some questions. I saw a question in the middle.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask
Maybe it would be good if you had a microphone.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to ask Professor Raj, especially about how did you treat migration across the different states in U.S., especially if you link it with the different fiscal policies, across the states. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So, that's a good question. So to be clear, in those maps that I was showing you, the way migration is being dealt with is we're actually mapping people back to where they grew up. So many of those people, when we're measuring their incomes as adults, they're not living where they grew up, right? So if you grew up in the rural Midwest and you're doing very well, often you've moved to a place like New York or Boston or Chicago when we're measuring your income in adulthood, which is the power of these data, that we can track you no matter where you are. As you note, that has important implications for fiscal policy and in a way creates a set of externalities across space that are problematic, because if you're thinking about, say, investing in a state educational institution to help people come up, but a lot of those people are going to leave, then they're not going to contribute to your tax base. And so related to this earlier discussion about new policy instruments, you might wonder, normally we tax people based on their current location, but this can misalign incentives to invest in a dynamic sense could it make sense to think about taxes that somehow map back to where you accumulated human capital? Those are interesting things to think about.
Question here.
Thank you very much. Very fascinating. I have a question about your analysis of the history of economic thought. This is very nice, and it's about the published papers, right? In the top 5 plus the other 2. So my question is, I don't know if historical data exists on this, but is this a result more of the review process of the papers that are published, or the supply of research? Right? I mean, maybe if you have data of all the submitted papers, whether they pass the first stage of less rejection or those who went to review, would that pattern hold also for the supply of research, or is it more like a result, how the peer review process is mediating, that trajectory?
That's a great question. It certainly must be, except for, so earlier on, the review process was quite different. So I think it's an interesting question that someone with far more diligence and willingness to kind of invest in trying to. This is not really my comparative advantage of digging into in some sense the supply side rather than the published output, and the output that. So this is a really selected sample. Okay, there are 7 journals, and the reason for that is the ease of finding the whole text, the entire texts, and in some ways having taken out of your hands the selection process that you're pointing to.
Thank you so much. I have a very short question. So that proposition of the complementarity between theory and empirics really resonated. So I'd like to ask the audience, whoever wants to take this question, on what you think is an optimal strategy for young students of economics, or like in the strategic sense, to aspire to become a well-rounded economist who is proficient in machine learning methods and economic theory and networks, but at the same time, the traditional micro, macro metric sequence, or is it better to become a specialist and collaborate with others across fields? Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that becoming a specialist is probably unavoidable. And what I see that's happening with the natural science, for example, in medicine and in health research, is you have clinical research, which is like applied clinical trials, and you have pre-medical research, which is the basic. Traditionally, how it has worked is that the basics do their things, and when they have finished their things, they call clinicians and see if there is something to take advantage of. And the clinicians do the same thing. Once they have their data, call a theorist to see if they can make sense of it. And the trend these days is to promote mixed teams that from the very beginning, from the conception moment, you put together theorists and empirical to develop the research program. So I will answer the question saying that you should cultivate the ability to talk to other specialists.
Yeah, and just one thing to add, and it relates a bit to what you said, Andreu, about AI. So I think that you are in a generation in which barriers to entry into some dimensions of economics research have been lowered, and so you can get the AI assistant to help you along. And so I think that it's possible for people to, I think in the coming generation, to be able to be broader than was possible in the past because of this assistance.
One quick thing, which is I think being inspired by a clear question and acquiring the relevant methods for that is, at least in my experience, a useful approach. As you pointed out, there are numerous different methods one could try to acquire, but I think many different skills can be useful. When you have a clear problem in mind, I think it comes together effectively.
I think we have time for one more question right here.
Thank you, Professor Maskin. My question is for Professor Chetty. So in your social capital paper, you use an example of two schools with similar socioeconomic compositions. So despite equal exposure, one of them exhibits higher economic connections because they have an entrance exam that attracts then brighter students, then friendship bias is reduced. So the actionable insight for private institutions would be to maximize for those connections and therefore attract or offer scholarships for bright kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. But could that be in conflict with a national interest, since once you set that bar higher, then those kids would have done well otherwise? They would have gotten scholarships elsewhere. How do you balance those two objectives, being in either a private or a institution or public policy?
So thanks for that. So let me answer that in two steps. So first, just for a little bit of context for those who may not be familiar, in that Facebook data where I was arguing that who you're connected to really matters for people's long-term outcomes, there are two dimensions that really matter for the degree of cross-class connection in society. The first is exposure, whether you're in the same colleges, the same neighborhoods, the same schools as high-income people. If you're a low-income person, are you just even exposed to those sorts of people? And then the second, which is what you're focused on, is what we call friending bias, even conditional on all of us being in the same room. What types of connections are formed in this room? Are people connecting across different lines, or do people kind of self-segregate, within a given university, within a given setting? And that latter force actually turns out to be quite important empirically. It varies quite a bit across settings in certain schools and certain colleges. As you note, there are things one can do, like if you select people on the basis of an entrance exam, you tend to see in those kinds of settings, maybe because everyone has something in common, they're studious, they're motivated by a certain goal, you tend to have more cross-class friendships and so forth. But as you also note, it's not clear if you look at it from any one institution's perspective to maximize that type of connection. Does that align with what you want socially? Because there can be effectively externalities. You're drawing people out of the pool who may have gone to some other place. And on net, it's not clear that that's desirable. And so in a way, I think that ties back nicely to the theme of this session, where that paper is really a reduced form empirical paper, looking at it from the perspective of a single unit partial equilibrium in some sense. But to really make progress and answer your question, you need to think about this from a general equilibrium perspective. You need to come back to the tools of economic theory to think about how this plays out in equilibrium. We're actually doing some work with that on that with Matt Jackson at the moment. And those are the kinds of questions, I think, by blending new evidence, new data with economic theory, we can hope to answer going forward.
And on that optimistic note, I think we can conclude. Let's thank our panel.